Yes, but she's broken. The internment camp, my father's death, the news about the bomb destroying her hometown, her family. She's alive, but she's not okay. I don't know if she'll ever be okay. Takahashi paused. I'm telling you this because you asked me once why I do this work. Why I help Japanese prisoners when Japanese soldiers killed my father. And I think the answer is because someone has to build bridges. Someone has to say that the cycle can stop. My mother can't do it. She's too damaged. My father can't do it. He's dead. But I can. You can. We can carry the weight so the next generation doesn't have to. That's a heavy burden, Keiko said, echoing Michiko's words from months ago. Yes, but it's the only way forward I can see. Revenge just creates more revenge. Hatred just breeds more hatred. So we build bridges, even when it hurts, even when no one thanks us, even when both sides think we're traitors. Because bridges are how people cross divides. They embraced, two women from opposite sides of a war, united by the understanding that survival meant carrying impossible weights with grace. Part 10. Return and Reckoning. The ship that carried Keiko and Michiko back to Japan was crowded, filthy, nothing like the clean hospital ship that had brought them to America. This was mass transportation, efficient and uncomfortable, designed to move bodies from one place to another without concern for dignity or comfort. The prisoners on board were a mix of soldiers, sailors, civilians, all united by defeat and the uncertain future ahead. Some were excited to return home, clinging to the belief that Japan would welcome them, would need them in the rebuilding. Others were silent, hollow-eyed, understanding that they were returning to a nation that had no use for survivors of a failed war. Keiko spent the voyage on deck when possible, watching the Pacific roll past, thinking about everything that had happened since she'd crossed this ocean the first time. She'd left Japan as a true believer, certain of national righteousness, ready to serve the empire. She was returning as something else, a witness, a survivor, someone who'd eaten hamburgers and accepted Christmas gifts and learned that enemy and human weren't mutually exclusive categories. They arrived in Yokohama in April 1946 to a gray sky and grayer welcome. No crowds, no families, just military officials processing paperwork and civilian police watching with suspicious eyes. The returned prisoners were documented, questioned, categorized. Where were you captured? What did you tell the Americans? Did you cooperate? Did you betray secrets? Keiko answered honestly. Yes, she'd cooperated. She'd worked in the camp infirmary. She'd attended a tea social with American civilians. She'd eaten American food, accepted American gifts, been treated with respect by American guards. She didn't lie. Didn't minimize, just stated facts. The officials wrote everything down with faces that revealed nothing. After hours of questioning, she was released with papers that identified her as a returned POW, along with an address for a refugee center where she could get temporary housing. Your family? An official asked. My mother is in Okinawa, I think, in a refugee camp. I'll find her. Good luck. The words were perfunctory, meaningless. The Tokyo that Keiko found was nothing like the Tokyo she'd left. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash by firebombing. People lived in shacks made from scrap metal and salvaged wood. Food lines stretched for blocks, thousands of people waiting for rations that were never enough. Children with swollen bellies from malnutrition begged on street corners. The emperor was still technically in power, but General MacArthur and the American occupation forces made the real decisions. Japan had survived, but barely, and it was surviving on American terms, with American food under American authority. The nation that had promised death before dishonor was alive and dishonored, and no one knew how to process that reality. Keiko made her way to the refugee center, a former school building now crowded with displaced people. She gave her name, her POW papers, and asked if there was any way to get a message to Okinawa to find her mother. The worker, a tired woman in her 40s, looked at the POW papers and her expression hardened. You were captured. Yes. You surrendered. Yes. The woman's voice dropped to a whisper. You should leave. People here, they don't understand. They lost everything while fighting to the end. If they find out you surrendered, that you're alive because you gave up, it won't be safe for you. Where should I go? Anywhere else. Maybe Osaka, maybe back to America if they'll take you. Just not here. Not where everyone is angry and looking for someone to blame. Keiko left the refugee center and walked through the ruins of Tokyo as the sun set. She passed groups of former soldiers, identifiable by their bearing even in civilian clothes, clustered around fires made from debris. She passed women who'd lost husbands, children who'd lost parents, everyone marked by loss and looking for meaning in it. She found a small shrine that had somehow survived the firebombing, its gates charred but standing. She went inside and sat in the empty courtyard, looking at the sky that was the same sky that had covered the POW camp in New Mexico, the same sky that covered America and Japan and everywhere else, indifferent to human suffering. She pulled out her notebooks, the documentation she'd kept of her time in captivity, page after page of truth that no one wanted to hear. She thought she could be a witness, could tell Japan what had really happened. But the refugee center worker had been right. No one was ready for complicated truth. They needed simple stories, brave Japanese fighting to the end, evil Americans committing atrocities. They needed to believe the loss had meaning, that the suffering had purpose. A hamburger and a Coca-Cola didn't fit that narrative. Christmas gifts from church ladies didn't fit. Guards who learned prisoners' names didn't fit. Keiko sat in the shrine as darkness fell and made a decision. She would keep the notebooks, but she wouldn't share them. Not yet. Not until Japan was ready to hear that mercy was possible, that enemy didn't mean monster, that sometimes the hardest thing wasn't dying for your country, but living after your country had led you into a senseless war. She would survive. She would bear witness. She would wait. And someday, maybe decades from now, someone would be ready to listen. Epilogue. The Long View. Keiko found her mother 6 months later in a refugee camp outside Osaka. The reunion was complicated, emotional, full of tears and accusations and reconciliations that took weeks to work through. Her mother couldn't understand why Keiko had surrendered, couldn't reconcile the propaganda with the reality of her daughter being alive and relatively healthy. "They fed us hamburgers," Keiko said finally, when her mother demanded to know what had made her give up, what had made her betray everything they'd believed. Hamburgers? More food than I'd seen in months. Better food than Japanese soldiers got. Better food than civilians here are getting now. And I realized that if the enemy could feed prisoners that well, we'd already lost. The war was over before I surrendered. I just survived long enough to see it. Her mother didn't understand. Not really. But she accepted. What choice did she have? Her daughter was alive. In a nation of ghosts, of mourning, of collective trauma, having someone alive to hold was a gift, even if that person came wrapped in shame. Keiko found work eventually, in a hospital that was desperate enough for nurses that they didn't care about her POW status. She kept her head down, did her job, lived quietly. She sent letters to Reiko and Sachiko in America, learned that they'd found work, found lives, found something like peace in the country that had been their enemy. She kept the notebooks hidden, but she added to them. She documented post-war Japan, the occupation, the slow reconstruction, the way shame and trauma shaped a generation. She documented her mother's struggles, her own isolation, the way returned POWs were treated like invisible people, present but unacknowledged, and she waited. In 1952, the occupation ended. Japan regained sovereignty, began its economic recovery, started the long process of rebuilding not just infrastructure, but national identity. The shame began to fade, slowly, replaced by determination to never be defeated again. In 1965, Keiko was invited to speak at a conference on wartime experiences. 20 years had passed. A new generation was asking questions their parents couldn't answer. What really happened? What was it like? How did we survive? Keiko brought her notebooks. She stood in front of an audience of scholars, students, journalists, and she told the truth. About the hamburgers and the Coca-Cola, about Christmas gifts and tea socials, about guards who'd been kind and medics who'd been professional, and a system that had treated prisoners with dignity even when it would have been easier to be cruel. "I'm not saying America was perfect," she said carefully. "I'm not saying the war was justified, or that occupation was easy, or that everything that happened was right. I'm saying that people are complicated, that enemy and human aren't opposites, that sometimes the hardest thing to accept is mercy from someone you've been taught to hate." The audience was silent. Some looked angry, uncomfortable with this narrative that didn't fit the preferred story of American brutality. Some looked thoughtful, processing, reconsidering. Some looked relieved, as if they'd been waiting for someone to say it was okay to admit that maybe, possibly, things had been more complex than propaganda allowed. After the speech, a young reporter approached her. "Do you think what happened to you was typical? Do you think other prisoners were treated this way?" "I don't know," Keiko said honestly. "I can only speak to my experience, but I think most Americans tried to follow their rules. Not all, not always, but enough that it mattered. Enough that we survived when we'd been told survival was impossible." The reporter took notes, asked more questions, eventually published an article that generated controversy and conversation. Some people accused Keiko of being brainwashed, of being a traitor, of spreading American propaganda. Others thanked her for telling a truth they'd suspected but couldn't voice. Keiko didn't try to convince anyone. She just kept telling her story, kept bearing witness, kept insisting that complexity was more honest than simplicity, even when simplicity was more comforting. She lived to be 93 years old, long enough to see Japan become an economic powerhouse, long enough to see former enemies become allies, long enough to see a world where the idea of another war between America and Japan seemed absurd, impossible, unthinkable. She published her notebooks as a memoir in 1987, 42 years after the war ended. It became a modest bestseller in Japan, required reading in some history courses, evidence that even the most total war left room for humanity if people chose to look for it. In the introduction, she wrote, "I was taught that Americans were monsters. They gave me a hamburger and shattered that belief. Everything that came after, the confusion, the shame, the slow rebuilding of understanding, started with that moment. With the realization that we'd been lied to about who our enemies were, which meant we'd been lied to about who we were. The hardest part of surviving war isn't the combat. It's living with the knowledge that you believed lies and acted on them and can't undo the damage done. All you can do is refuse to lie moving forward. To insist on truth even when it's complicated, even when it's painful, even when no one wants to hear it. That's the price of survival. That's the weight of being a witness. And I've carried it for 42 years because someone had to, because bridges don't build themselves, because the next war is prevented by people who remember the last one honestly, without romanticism or revision, just the complicated truth of what actually happened." The memoir was translated into English in 1989. Keiko received letters from American veterans who'd served as guards in POW camps, who thanked her for confirming that their efforts to be humane had mattered, had been noticed, had made a difference. She received letters from children and grandchildren of Japanese Americans, like Sergeant Linda Takahashi, who'd served as translators and medics and bridges between worlds. And she received a letter from Reiko, now in her 70s, living in California with her American husband and 3 children, working as a nurse at a hospital in San Francisco. "I read your book," Reiko wrote, "and I cried, because you captured it exactly. That moment when the hamburger and the Coca-Cola broke us open, made us question everything, forced us to reckon with the truth. I've lived in America for 44 years now. I've raised my children here. I've built a life here. And people always ask if I feel American or Japanese, as if I have to choose. But I'm both and neither. I'm someone who was shattered and rebuilt in a shape that doesn't fit either country completely. And that's okay. That's the price of surviving what we survived. We get to be complicated. We get to contain multitudes. We get to refuse simple categories." Keiko kept that letter until she died, along with her notebooks, along with photographs from the tea social and the Christmas gifts, and letters from her mother and from Sergeant Takahashi, who'd stayed in touch for decades. 2 women bound by having built a bridge during a war that demanded only destruction. On her deathbed, surrounded by family, her nieces and nephews, her mother having died years before, Keiko's last words were, "Tell the truth, even when it's complicated. Especially when it's complicated. That's how we honor the dead and protect the living." They buried her with a copy of her memoir, with the notebooks that had survived longer than the war, with the truth she'd spent a lifetime protecting and sharing and insisting mattered. The hamburger moment, as she'd always thought of it, had been the crack in the wall of certainty. Everything after had been learning to live in a world without walls, without certainty, with only the complicated truth that people were capable of both cruelty and mercy, and which one prevailed was a choice, not a destiny. That was the story she'd told. That was the witness she'd borne. And in the end, people listened. Not everyone, not immediately, but enough, eventually. Because the truth, no matter how complicated, has a weight that lies can never match. And witnesses, no matter how long they wait, eventually find an audience ready to hear. That's the hope, anyway. That's the story. That's what surviving the hamburger moment taught. That mercy is possible, that enemy is temporary, that truth is complicated, and that bearing witness to complexity is the hardest and most necessary work of all. The end.